My name is Jacob William Sanderson. Before I took the contract at Glacier National Park, I spent 12 years as a structural fire captain in Chicago. I thought I knew what danger looked like. I thought danger was something you could see, smell, and fight with a hose and an axe. But the woods don't fight you. They just wait for you to forget who you are. Whispering Pines Lake is tucked away in a glacial cirque that most maps don't even bother to label. It's a stunning piece of water, flat, dark, and so still it looks like a sheet of black glass dropped into a bowl of granite. The pines that surround it are ancient. Their branches so thick they block out the sun even at noon. They call it whispering because of the way the wind catches the needles, creating a sound that, if you're tired enough, starts to sound like a crowd of people talking just out of earshot. I was assigned to the lake after a seasonal worker named Sarah disappeared. She wasn't a hiker, she was a researcher studying water acidity. She had a base camp set up on the eastern shore. One morning, her radio checked in at 0800 hours. At 0900 hours, her GPS pinger went dead. When the first response team arrived, they found her sampling kit sitting at the edge of the water. Her boots were floating 20 feet out in the lake, tied together at the laces. But Sarah was gone. I arrived a week later to maintain the site while the official investigation was put on hold, which is Park Service code for "we don't know what happened and we're tired of looking." My first night at the cabin was suffocatingly quiet. The cabin is a small, one-room cedar shack about a half-mile from the water. I was sitting on the porch, cleaning my gear, when I heard it for the first time. It wasn't a scream. It was a whistle, a short, melodic trill that sounded exactly like the tea kettle in my old apartment in Chicago. I froze. I didn't have a kettle here. I only had a small camping stove, and it wasn't even on. "Hello?" I called out, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy mag light on the bench. The forest didn't answer, but the whispering of the pines seemed to get louder. A low-frequency hum that made the floorboards under my feet vibrate. I shined my light into the tree line. The ponderosa pines stood like jagged teeth against the night sky. Then, a voice came from the dark. "Jacob, did you remember to lock the back door?" My blood turned to ice. It was a woman's voice. Soft, slightly raspy, with a North Side Chicago accent. It was my ex-wife, Claire. I hadn't spoken to her in 5 years. She was 3,000 miles away, and there was absolutely no reason, none, for her to be standing in the middle of a Montana wilderness at midnight. "Claire?" I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. Is that you?" I stepped off the porch, the dry needles crunching like broken glass under my boots. I followed the sound, swinging my light frantically. I knew it couldn't be her. I knew it was impossible. But the voice was so perfect, so identical to the woman I had shared a life with, that my brain refused to accept the logic of the woods. "Jacob, come here. I found something. It's so beautiful." The voice was moving further into the trees, toward the lake. I pushed through a thicket of brush, the branches scratching at my face. I didn't care about the protocol. I didn't care about the bears or the mountain lions. I just needed to see her. I broke through the final line of trees and reached the shore of Whispering Pines Lake. The moon was out, reflecting off the water with a cold, silver light. And there, standing right at the water's edge, wasn't a woman. It was a staircase. It was a freestanding set of wooden stairs, maybe 6 steps high. made of pristine white oak that looked like it had just been polished. It had no railings, no house attached to it, no foundation. It was just sitting there on the mud, looking perfectly out of place in the raw wilderness. And sitting on the very top step was Sarah's research notebook. I stepped closer, the whispering of the trees now sounding like 1,000 voices screaming in a library. I shined my light on the notebook. It was open to the last page. In Sarah's neat, professional handwriting, there was only one sentence written over and over again, covering the entire page. Do not step on the third stair. I looked up at the staircase. From the shadows beneath the third step, a pair of pale, elongated fingers reached out, gripping the wood with a strength that made the oak groan. I stood there, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing. A pristine, white oak staircase in the middle of a Montana wilderness is more terrifying than any grizzly bear. It was an assault on logic. It looked like it had been plucked from a high-end Victorian home and dropped into the mud by some giant, invisible hand. There was no dust on the wood, no scratches, no signs of weathering, despite the humidity of the lake. The pale fingers gripped the edge of the third stair, their knuckles white and bony. They didn't move. They didn't retreat. They just stayed there, anchored to the wood. Jacob, please. It's so cold. Help me up. The voice, Claire's voice, wasn't coming from the tree line anymore. It was coming from inside the stairs, or rather, from the empty space beneath them. It sounded muffled, like someone speaking through a thick wool blanket. Sarah? I called out, my voice cracking. Sarah, is that you under there? I took a step toward the staircase. My boots sank into the soft, silty bank of the lake. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run, but the fire captain in me, the man who spent a decade running into burning buildings while everyone else ran out, wouldn't let me move. If there was a woman trapped under that structure, I had to help. I shined my mag light directly at the gap beneath the stairs. The beam of light should have illuminated the mud and the underside of the wood. Instead, it did nothing. The light seemed to curve around the staircase, or perhaps the space beneath it was so dark it simply swallowed the photons. It was a void. A perfect, rectangular hole in the world. Sarah, I'm coming to the side. Stay calm, I said, trying to keep my professional rescue voice steady. I moved to the left, intending to look behind the stairs. But as I moved, the staircase moved too. Not by sliding on the mud, it simply reoriented itself. No matter how I circled it, I was always facing the front of the steps. It was like a 2D image in a video game that always turns to face the player. It defied perspective. It defied physics. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel the pulse in my eyeballs. I looked back at Sarah's notebook, still resting on the top step. The wind caught a page. Flipping it over, there was a sketch. It was a drawing of the staircase, but in the sketch, the stairs were hundreds of feet tall, reaching up into a sky filled with multiple moons. Beneath the sketch, one word was scrawled in jagged, frantic letters: feedback. Suddenly, the whispering of the pines stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It was a dead silence, the kind you find in a sensory deprivation tank. Then, a new sound started. A slow, rhythmic thump, thump, thump from inside the stairs. It sounded like a heavy heart beating, or maybe someone knocking on a thick wooden door from the other side. The fingers on the third stair began to pull. Slowly, a head began to emerge from the darkness beneath the wood. But it wasn't Sarah, and it wasn't Claire. It was a face that looked like it had been molded out of gray, wet clay. It had no eyes, only deep, hollow pits. It had no nose. Its mouth was a wide, toothless grin that stretched from ear to ear, frozen in a silent laugh. The creature's neck was impossibly long, corded with thick, pulsing veins. As it pulled itself further out, I saw that its body was fused with the wood of the third stair. It wasn't hiding under the stairs, it was the stairs. "Jacob," the creature said. This time the voice didn't sound like Claire. It sounded like me. It was my own voice, with the same Chicago rasp, the same cadence. "Step on the third stair, Jacob. We need to check the stability. It's part of the routine. Just a routine check." The creature started to mimic my own actions. It reached for its hip, where I had my radio. It tilted its head exactly the way I did when I was confused. It was recording me in real time. I backed away, but my heel caught on a protruding pine root. I stumbled, falling hard onto my back. My flashlight flew out of my hand, rolling across the mud until the beam was pointed directly at the lake. In the reflected light of the water, I saw them. There wasn't just one staircase. All along the shoreline, dozens of them were beginning to rise out of the dark water. Some were made of marble, some of rotted oak, some of gleaming steel, and on each one, a gray, clay-like figure was pulling itself out of the void, their eyeless faces all turning toward me. They all spoke at once, a chorus of my own voice echoing across the lake. "Step on the third stair, Jacob. It's just a routine check. Professional routine. Step on the third stair." I lay there on the cold, damp mud, the air in my lungs feeling like shards of glass. My flashlight lay 5 feet away, its beam flickering as it struggled against the encroaching darkness of the lake. The chorus of my own voice, hundreds of versions of me, all demanding a routine check, created a wall of sound that felt like it was vibrating the very atoms of my brain. I scrambled backward, my hands scraping against sharp stones and rotted pine cones. The primary staircase, the one made of white oak, began to tilt forward. It wasn't falling, it was leaning toward me. The gray, clay-faced entity stretching its neck out until its toothless grin was inches from my face. "The structure is compromised, Captain." My own voice hissed from its throat. "We need a primary assessment. Just step up. 1 foot on the third, 1 foot on the void." I reached for my belt, searching for my flare gun. My fingers were numb, fumbling with the holster. As I finally clicked it open, one of the other staircases, a rotted, moss-covered thing, rose out of the water just inches behind me. I could hear the wood groaning as it displaced the dark lake water. Squelch, creak, squelch. I didn't look back. I pointed the flare gun straight at the face of the creature in front of me and pulled the trigger. Thump. The flare didn't explode against its face. Instead, the red ball of fire entered the creature's open, grinning mouth and vanished. There was no impact. No heat. The creature simply swallowed the light, and for a split second, its entire translucent neck glowed a sickly, pulsing red. It looked like a neon tube filled with blood. The creature's smile widened. "Thank you for the energy, Jacob. It's been so long since we had something bright The whispering of the pines returned then, but it wasn't the wind anymore. It was the sound of Sarah. I could hear her voice coming from the trees, but it wasn't a call for help. She was reciting water acidity levels. 6.4. 6.2. 5.8. Over and over, a mindless loop of her professional routine played back by the forest itself. I realized then what this place was. It wasn't a haunting. It was a recording studio. The pines, the lake, the stairs, they were all part of a massive organic mechanism that captured the echoes of people who were isolated enough, quiet enough to be heard. Sarah hadn't just disappeared, she had been recorded until there was nothing left of the original. The gray entity reached out a long, damp hand and gripped my ankle. Its touch didn't feel like skin. It felt like cold, wet silt. "Let go!" I screamed, kicking at it with my heavy work boot. Where my boot hit the creature, the clay-like substance didn't bruise, it sampled me. I felt a sharp, electric sting, and suddenly, I could feel my own memories being pulled out through my heel. I saw my wedding day, the smell of smoke from my first big fire in Chicago, the taste of the coffee I had this morning, all of it flowing into the creature like water down a drain. The creature's face began to change. The pits where its eyes should be started to fill with a familiar shade of blue. My blue. Its jaw narrowed. Its skin began to take on the texture of my 5 o'clock shadow. "I'm feeling much better now, Captain," it said. And this time, the voice was indistinguishable from the one in my own head. I looked at the third stair. Sarah's notebook was starting to dissolve into the wood, becoming a permanent part of the oak. I knew that if I didn't break the loop now, I would end up like her, a voice in the trees and a notebook on a stair that led nowhere. I didn't have a weapon that could hurt them, but I had something they were obsessed with. The routine. I stopped fighting. I stood up. Though my legs felt like lead, I looked the creature, the version of me, straight in the eye. "You want a routine check?" I said, my voice cold and flat. "Fine, but you're doing it wrong. A captain doesn't step on the third. A captain checks the foundation first." The creature paused. The hundreds of other staircases in the lake stopped their groaning. The collective mimicry went silent. I had introduced a glitch in their recording. "The foundation is in the water," I continued, backing slowly toward the deep end of the lake. "If you want the full record, you have to follow the captain into the deep." The creature tilted its head. It didn't have a mind, it only had a program. And the program said to follow the leader. It began to crawl off the stairs, its long, distorted body dragging behind it like a tail. The other creatures began to slip back into the dark water, their eyeless faces fixed on me. I turned and dove into the lake. The water was freezing, a shock to my system that nearly stopped my heart. I swam down, deeper and deeper, into the black abyss where the whispering couldn't reach. I looked back and saw the white oak staircase sinking behind me, the gray figure still trying to mimic my swimming stroke, its movements clumsy and heavy. I kept going until my lungs felt like they were going to burst, until the silver surface of the lake was a distant, unreachable memory. I found a submerged rock ledge and wedged myself under it, holding my breath until the world started to turn gray at the edges. I waited for the echo to find me. But in the crushing pressure of the deep water, there was no sound. There was only the absolute, silent cold. Marikita Selisaikan Narasi Inidengan, Part 4, The Silent Anchor. Bahagian penutup ini akan dibuat dengan tempo yang sangat lambat, fokus pada detail, sensorik yang menyesakan, dan memberikan open ending yang menghantui Kazgaya, The Lone Guardian. Whispering Pines Lake Part 4, The Silent Anger. The pressure in my ears was a dull, throbbing roar. Down here, in the freezing guts of Whispering Pines Lake, the world was reduced to two things: the desperate need for oxygen and the absolute absence of sound. I stayed pinned under that rock ledge, my lungs screaming, watching the pale, distorted shape of the other me drift past in the dark water. It was still trying to mimic my swimming stroke, but without the resistance of the surface. Its movements were grotesque slow-motion thrashing that looked more like a dying fish than a man. It drifted deeper, its clay-like body becoming more translucent the further it got from the staircase. It was a recording without a playback device, fading into the static of the deep. When my vision began to tunnel and sparks of white light danced in the corners of my eyes, I finally let go of the ledge. I kicked upward, my muscles screaming in protest. Every inch felt like a mile. When I finally broke the surface, I didn't gasp for air. I didn't make a sound. I remembered Sarah's loop. I remembered how the trees caught the noise. I drifted silently to the western shore, far away from where the white oak staircase had stood. I crawled out of the water like a drowned rat, my body shaking so violently I thought my bones would shatter. I looked back across the lake. The moon was still there, cold and indifferent. The water was flat again, a sheet of black glass. The staircases were gone. There were no white steps, no marble risers, no gray figures. It was as if the lake had never been anything more than a mirror. But on the eastern bank, where I had first seen the oak stairs, the mud was disturbed. A perfect, rectangular indentation remained in the silt, the footprint of something that didn't belong in this world. I didn't go back to the cabin. I knew my voice was already there. I knew that if I stepped onto that porch, I would hear myself cleaning my gear. I would hear myself calling out to Claire. Instead, I started walking. I followed the ridgeline, staying on the hard granite where I wouldn't leave tracks. I didn't use my flashlight. I moved by the pale light of the stars, a ghost in a forest of ghosts. I walked for 6 hours until I reached the ranger station at the main trailhead. The ranger on duty, a young guy named Miller, looked up from his coffee when I stumbled in, dripping wet and shivering. "Captain Sanderson, what happened? We lost your radio signal hours ago." I opened my mouth to speak, to tell him about the stairs and the clay-faced things and the recording in the pines. But as I drew breath, I felt a sharp, cold prickling in the back of my throat. I remembered the way the creature swallowed my flare. I remembered the way it sampled my memories. I realized that if I spoke, I wouldn't be the one talking. I would just be providing more material for the pines. I would be feeding the loop. I reached out and grabbed Miller's notepad and a pen. My hands were steady now, unnaturally so. I wrote, "Sarah is gone, site compromised. Do not send anyone else. Radios are not safe." Miller stared at the note, then at me. "Captain, you're shaking. Just sit down, tell me what you saw." I shook my head. I pointed at the note and then at the door. I walked out of that station without saying a single word. I left the Park Service the next day. I moved to a small town in the high desert of Nevada, a place where there are no trees, no lakes, and the only sound is the dry whistle of the wind over the sand. I live in a trailer with no radio, no TV, and no neighbors. I've been silent for 3 years now, People think I'm a mute, or maybe just a crazy vet who saw too much in the city. They don't know that I'm a guardian. I'm the anchor. As long as I don't speak, the echo of Jacob Sanderson remains incomplete. As long as I don't make a sound, the things at Whispering Pines Lake don't have a captain to lead them out of the water. But sometimes, when the wind blows hard from the north, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth, I hear it. I'll be sitting in my chair, and I'll hear a voice coming from the corner of the room. It's my voice. It's the voice of a Chicago fire captain, clear and authoritative. Routine check, Jacob. It's just a routine check. Why is it so quiet in here? Did you remember to lock the back door? I don't answer. I just sit in the dark, my heart beating in the silence, waiting for the sun to rise. Because I know that as long as I'm quiet, I'm still real. But I wonder if I'm the one sitting in the chair, then who is the one doing the talking? And more importantly, who is the one listening?